Good evening, everybody, and thank you, Tracey, very much for coming to talk to us. It's a great treat to have you here. I don't know that many people know about your work, except possibly two in the audience, and I'm sure they'll have plenty of questions, and you may well as well. But thank you for coming. I know it's been very hot and practically impossible to think, as far as I'm concerned. Can you hear me all right? No, just a bit louder. Okay? All right. Tracey is a rare thing. She's an artist and a fine binder. She's given lectures all over the world, and she collaborates with other people. She lifts bookbinding and fine binding into the world of fine art with apparently no difficulty, but I know a great deal of thought and trouble. And I'm just going to quote Emma Hill, who wrote a nice little piece about her. There is an essential paradox that distinguishes Tracey Rowledge's work. Her practice straddles fine art and the applied art of bookbinding. She makes objects that are free from the constraints of usage and objects whose treatment is entirely defined by function. Drawing and materiality play important roles in each. It is the coexistence of two ways of thinking that informs the infinitely subtle judgments Rowledge is known for in her commissioned bindings, and which makes her fine art objects at times tantalizingly difficult to characterize. Whether on a book cover or a support, Rowledge's approach elevates the tiniest of fragments, a scribble, a crumpled shopping list, into an object of beauty, a focus for thought. So that, I think, says a great deal about you and your work. And I wondered whether it would, just before we get cracking from you, it would be nice for people who know nothing about bookbinding and fine binding to hear a little bit about her notes, Tracey's notes, on a couple of commissions she's had. One was Satire Against Virtue, which she did in 2007. And it was bound in chestnut brown goatskin and gold tooled. Her notes say, this commissioned binding is sewn into a concertina, which is rounded and backed. The appearance and function of the book is that of a standard fine binding, but the concertina ensures that there is no stress on the spine folds and for the pages to open completely flat. The book has hand-sewn end bands and laced-on laminated pasteboards. The overall image is tooled on moon gold leaf, using one decorative finishing tool. The binding is signed and dated on the inside of the rear cover and is housed in a cloth-covered drop-back box with a gold-tooled leather label on the spine. This gold-tooled image is designed to sit well with the period and nature of the text block, and it allowed me to further develop my interest to work, both structurally and aesthetically, in harmony with antiquarian books. Of the work I've seen of yours, which isn't a huge amount, I've always been struck by the originality, the amount of thought, and how your imagination goes with whatever it is you're looking at and dealing with. And I wondered if you would like to tell us how that comes about in terms of, if it's a book, is it the content of the book or is it the materials? How does it start to work in your imagination? Or is that too difficult to describe?
I was smiling when you were reading the description about the fine binding, because I imagine, I don't know, that probably most of you all don't know anything about bookbinding, and you are suddenly plunged into the specificity of my world at the bench.
That's right.
And the language of bookbinding and the language of fine binding, which is very specific within bookbinding. So my training was that I went to art school, and then I found out about bookbinding, and I thought I could make a living as a bookbinder to support making art. In learning bookbinding, I realised that bookbinding could be a creative medium in itself. So at art school, I had been very interested in drawing and in mark making. And when I came to learn gold tooling, as much as I hated gold tooling at college, I realised that there was a lot of potential within gold tooling in terms of exploring gestural mark making. So you've got gestural mark making, but you've got a very traditional, highly technical process of gold tooling. So it's playing with how something looks and how something is made, and I just really enjoyed bringing these things together and creating images that were very, very contemporary with something that was very traditional. So I started to receive commissions, fine binding commissions, and for me, from the beginning, they felt like a collaboration. So a client would come to me with a book that they really love, and they would tell me what they love about the book. We talk money, obviously, first, so that I know what the budget is, get that out of the way, and then what colours they really love, what they don't like, what images, what books of mine they like and don't like, so that I then have a brief to work to. And what's really interesting for me is working with a very restricted brief, because you've got bookbinding that's very restrictive in terms of a book has to function, a fine binding. It has to open flat. So you have to technically be a very good binder in order to make a book that is very enjoyable to read. So there's all these elements to think about, and then you need to be creative on top. So it's having those two things floating at the same time. You've got the structural engineering, and then you've got the creativity. So you need to think about, I'm always thinking about how to convey an idea of the novel, what the book is about, through the materials, the colour, the structure, and how the book feels in your hand before you've even opened it. And you then feel the tooling in your hands when the book is open, and how it smells, just the whole thing. I'm not a big reader. I don't really enjoy reading overly. So what I really want is for other people to enjoy reading the books that I bind, and to have the pleasure that I don't seem to be able to have. So I really enjoy the challenge of bookbinding and its restrictions. I find that makes me even more creative.
Yeah, I'm sure it does. But so every single commission is a huge collaboration.
Yeah, because
with the commissioner.
That person has enabled me to make my next piece of work. So, and also quite often somebody's coming to me and they've never commissioned a book before. So, it's part of my role is really to, I don't mean this in a patronising way, but it's to educate them so that they understand what a fine binding is and what it can be. Because there's no point them giving me money for something that I don't feel proud of. It's then they've then lost that money, and I've wasted my time. What for what? You know. So this person has enabled me to make this piece of work that I would never ever have made had they not come along with that book, and with their response to that book, and their colour choices and all those things. I find that really fascinating.
It is, and I'm sure it feeds into all your other work as well, doesn't it?
Yeah, because what I've realised in making the piece of work that's here, is that you spend years and years and years grafting, standing at the bench, working, honing your skills, pushing, so that when you make a piece of work, it doesn't carry the weight of time that it's taken you to make it. So that you don't want somebody to pick up a piece of your work and feel sorry for you because they can see it's taken you 500 hours. I want people to look at a piece of work and go, oh, I love it. This piece of work could not be any other way. It just sits right. It sits well. So yeah, the thing that I realise is that having spent all of these years pushing my skill set, is that they then, all these skills and materials that I've got to know so intimately just become part of my making vocabulary, so that when I'm thinking of an idea, I then kind of just get all of this knowledge, put it out on the bench, as it were, and just sift through it and think, I think this is where I'll begin. I'll pick up this material or the essence. It's always playing around with the nuance of a material, so that when I make work, I'm representing a material so that it conveys an emotional quality or something quite other than what you would expect that material to feel like or be like. I don't know if that really makes sense, a bit too abstract, but...
No, it does. It makes very good sense. But on the piece that you've made for this exhibition, you thought a long time about it, I know. So there was a timeline, and gradually these ideas came from Tracey about how she was thinking about it. But literally, I believe that you took this millboard, which is it a very specific material?
Yeah, it's an archival board that I use for making boxes and for making boxes,
right,
to house fine bindings.
Yes.
Yeah.
And then you gessoed it, several layers, and then was the colour in your head from the beginning?
The colour actually comes from the notepad that I use to write endless lists on. I'm sure, like everybody else in lockdown, one of my main occupations is writing lists, and I felt that this particular yellow was really the perfect colour choice, because I could have chosen any colour, but for me, that was the right colour for this piece of work.
And how did you decide on the actual shapes and how they should be?
For a great many years, one of the things that I'm very bad at is throwing things away. I'm very quick to throw ideas away, drawings, things away like that. So I now have I'm very strict with myself that I'm not allowed to throw things away. I have to keep them. And so these bits of board are pieces that I've kept.
Right.
They're offcuts.
Remnants.
They're remnants. And so I felt that they were the perfect pieces of material to work with for this. And I had various ideas that I was exploring. And this piece of work was actually the most challenging out of all the ideas. And I just kept walking around that composition on the floor, I think for about 2 or 3 weeks. I just kept walking around it whilst I was doing drawing and playing with exploring sort of sculptures. And then I thought, why don't you just get on with the piece of work that you're avoiding on the floor?
So
and
we all do it.
It was because I had technically, and this is very common for me, as David knows, sitting in the audience, that I've collaborated with for about 10 years now. I'm quite often making a piece of work that technically I've got an idea for it, but technically I've got no idea how to make it. All I've got in my mind is the essence of how I want the piece of work to feel at the end. And so what I then have to do is to break that essence down into component parts so that I can then build it in actual material form. So with these pieces of millboard, I had to work out how I could then reconstruct that as a piece of work in terms of my bookbinding knowledge. So yeah.
So, and each day is different. It's got such a great title. Every shape is different. Every view of every shape is different, isn't it?
Mm.
And every mark on every day is different.
Mm.
So, and you talk about gathering of self and not wanting to feel without an anchor in this long, protracted time. And I think it's the most contemplative, extraordinary piece that you've produced that actually does include and build in oneself all those emotions. And it has the timeless quality, and yet it has that very intimate detail of everything that went into every day, however abstract, however hard work. 52 pence? What's that? But how did you come to think of drawing the mark making like that?
I've for a long time been interested in grids. So for me it's a grid. but it's a very kind of free-flowing grid. And the fact that I gessoed, I applied the gesso with a brush was intentional, because I wanted for the surface to be textured, so that not only was my hand having to be moved by working over the different layers, it was also being bumped by the brush marks. So as much as I was trying to draw a straight line, I was unable to do that. And I wanted that, because I needed for the drawing to have a very, very particular flow to it, so that it felt very calm and contemplative. And for me, what's really interesting about mark making is how a mark holds a very specific type of movement, so that when you're looking at an abstract painting or drawing, you can tell the speed in which the person made that mark. And for me, that's endlessly fascinating.
I imagine it took you quite a long time to do all that drawing, didn't it?
It did.
Yes. Well, it was worth every stroke and every effort. I think it's really stunning. So textures are really close to your heart, aren't they? And I wondered if, as a child, you ever found something that you remember so clearly, being compelled to pick up and take home and to treasure.
No, sort of the opposite. I didn't have any kind of attachment to things.
Anything. Really?
No.
Ah, interesting.
No.
In your head, you did.
I sort of have this push-pull continually, because I adore beautiful things.
That's clear.
But at the same time, I don't like stuff. So I'm always wanting to get rid of things, but at the same time, I'm falling in love with things.
Yes.
So
Quite
it's
hard.
a bit of a struggle,
Yes.
especially as I live in quite a small space.
Yes.
So I can be reckless getting rid of things, you see, which is very annoying.
Yes. Well, so that didn't go anywhere.
No, sorry.
That's all right. But I should just mention that Tracey's got work in the V&A and also in the British Museum, as well as many, many private collections all over the world. Your next collaboration with David is in Sweden, and he's a silversmith, you might be interested to know. So I don't know what they're going to concoct between them, but
We don't know either.
do you find these collaborations very interesting?
I do. I've collaborated from the beginning, and I think what I enjoy so much is that, because bookbinding is very focused on detail all the time, you can lose sight of its creative potential within the processes. And when you're working with other people, you're thinking very laterally, and I really enjoy thinking.
Yes.
And sometimes I think it's about, if you can get to the point where you're thinking about thinking, so that's your landscape.
Yes.
That's sort of where I'm always aiming at being. And I think with David, we both want the same thing from our collaborations. We want to push our boundaries so that where we end up, we've never been before. And so we will graft and graft until we have both reached that place, and we always really feel that we've reached it at the same time, and we really challenge each other, and we get right inside each other's practice, and it's exciting.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
And you had another collaboration, which was to do with...
Oh, with Sarah Warson?
Yes.
Yeah.
What Isn't Here Hasn't Happened, 2011, a 2-year period. And the pictures of it on your website are extraordinary. And it's just finding out about what you can do with the material, isn't it? I mean, just. But how did that go?
It was really interesting because I really love contemporary dance. So for me, this was so exciting to be able to get inside contemporary dance. What was very surprising was that I ended up learning more about myself than I did probably about contemporary dance. How I work, because of course Sarah works in a very different way to me, not just because she's a contemporary dancer, a choreographer and a jeweler, but she works with words, and I don't work with words until the work is finished and I'm trying to understand what it is I've made and put it into words. And for me that's interesting because then I know I'm in this new landscape. So that was very challenging for me. But what was the question that Sarah had from the beginning was, is it possible for a piece of contemporary dance to exist without her having to be present? So we created a piece of contemporary dance between us over this 2-year period, and I'd had this question in my mind over all of this time, and I had an idea how it might be possible to hold the movement in a drawing. So I said, I've got this idea. Well, we were funded by Siobhan Davies Dance Studios. So we rented a studio for a day and it had to be, I specified, it had to be a polished concrete floor because of what I was wanting in the drawing. Not really thinking about Sarah's body, I have to say. So we take the paper down. I spent 3 days shaving graphite sticks so that I could get the right size of shard. And then she wore numerous leotards and socks on her hands and feet and everything. And so we then Sarah did a fragment of the movement on the paper, and we could see that it would work. So we then rented a studio for a couple of weeks and created this series of drawings. And then we worked on the choreography to evolve the drawings. So really the choreography was the drawing tool to make the drawings.
Fantastic.
Yeah. So we had to be very careful when we left the studio because we were absolutely grey from graphite. Everywhere. And then there was a grey sort of trail to and from wherever we went, and where the drawing wasn't taped down, the concrete was grey.
Yes, sure.
Yeah.
Was it filmed? You're making it?
There is a film.
Yes.
Yeah, we haven't shared that because it's about the drawing.
Work in progress.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So that was very interesting, and I think it was such a fruitful process.
Yes. Well, pushing your boundaries all the time. I mean, I was going to say, have you got any ambition? I think I might just not bother to answer that, because clearly it's there. It's the drive. It's the passion to discover, isn't it?
It's like being an explorer, isn't it?
Yes.
An explorer into yourself to see what it is you can do.
Yes.
And I don't know what my next piece of work will
ever be.
Non-book binding wise, and so that for me is what keeps me going.
Yes.
Keeps me interested.
Yes.
And also to be very fluid with what I know.
Right.
So that I can use it in a way that I wouldn't, before I'd made that piece of work, have known was possible.
Right.
Yeah.
So every step is creating a new part of you and a new direction in your work, and it's very, very exciting. I did see a beautiful piece of Tracey's at Collect, which was, I don't know how big, it's talking about graphite made me think of it. It's, I suppose, 2 foot wide by
it's my
5 foot.
It's my height and 1.5 times my width. So it's 5'7.5" by that, my shoulders and another half.
And it is entirely graphite marks, and it's completely beautiful, sunk into a wall, or so that it is absolutely flush with.
No, it was slightly proud of the wall, but
Was
it
it?
probably, yeah.
I didn't read it as that.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
what was the title for that piece?
Notes for a Future Work 1, because it's got a very odd title, because David, Claire Toomey and I started a artist group called 6040.
Yes.
And Siobhan Davies invited us to set up a programme at her studios once a year, and we called it the Starting Point series, where we really set this up, 6040, to create opportunities for applied artists who are wanting to expand their practice, that just weren't getting the opportunity to do that otherwise at the time. And for speed, really, we just decided that the three of us would make a piece of work, and my idea was to create a piece of work that would hold the creative movement within the building. So it's on a gessoed surface, but it is just a solid graphite drawing. So it looks like a moving painting because of the texture in the graphite, which is just vertical. It looks like one brush mark, but in graphite. So it slows down the movement within the building, and for me it had a quality of a Vermeer painting or something. Yes. So I was just interested in making a very specific quality of reflection of the movement within the building.
Yeah, the light reflection on it is extraordinary.
Yeah, and it just changes, obviously it changes all the time.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, we could talk forever, but I'm sure you've got questions, and I wondered if anybody would like to ask Tracey anything about her work, her thoughts. Yeah. Caroline.
You mentioned at the beginning some difficulty with reading books. I was very interested about this. Could you just please explain a little bit more?
Well, I think I probably am a bit dyslexic, probably. And so I just probably have got a bit of a phobia about reading, and I have to make myself do it. And once I get locked into a book, I'm all right. But it's the thought of it. And I'm a very slow reader, which some people, some of my friends are very envious of, because I really take my time to absorb every word, which then means it might take me, a year or something, because I'm not reading much a day to actually get through a book. So yeah, it's sort of ironic, really, that I've ended up being a bookbinder. But I think it's the technical challenge of bookbinding that I find endlessly fascinating. That it is actually technically very difficult, because the book does have to function at the end of the day. So yeah, that's my.
Sally.
People bring you books to buy. What would you say is the split between the people who bring the books because they love them and they want them to live again, and the people who bring books because they want them to have a beautiful binding? I don't know if that makes sense. I mean,
it makes absolute sense.
It's the same, but the reason is different.
I would say it's mainly in the first category, especially people that commission fine binding. They mainly are extremely passionate about a particular author, So they will commission bindings on Rochester or Shakespeare or whatever the author is, and quite often it's people will have saved up to come and commission a binding, and they just will come from time to time to have another binding. Mainly it's for their love of reading.
Clive?
I imagine that most of your work is effectively rebinding, giving a new fine binding to an old book. How much do you, if at all, do you work with brand new, freshly, beautifully printed works?
It can be either. Quite often it's books that are in a binding, but the binding, ethically, you should not take a book out of a binding that gives it its value.
Yes, that's partly what I was getting at.
I wouldn't do that. That would be immoral. So again, that comes down to it being my responsibility to educate the client and say, no, I'm very happy to do a commission, but not on that book, or find a copy that's in a binding that's really poor. But from time to time they're in sheets, but the likelihood of finding a book that you really want bound that's in sheet form is quite small. That's the difficulty, and of sufficient quality. American and Canadian printing tends to be really very, very good.
And I think, am I right in thinking there are fewer fine printing presses than there used to be?
I would say so. Yeah.
Any more? Greg?
Do you think, Tracey, that your work with books, which is very, very precise and detailed and small scale, by and large, has influenced the sense of scale which you bring to your other work? Or is your fine art an escape from the constraints of bookbinding, or are they completely separate in your mind, or how does it work?
I just think I have an idea and I make it, and sometimes it's a book and sometimes it's something else. It's ideas based, really. And I think the turning point for me was I was very fortunate to go on an expedition to Disco Bay in West Greenland with an organisation called Cape Farewell, raising awareness about climate change. And the Crafts Council were very good in funding me my place to go as an opportunity for a mid-career maker. What it enabled me to do was to make work outside of the bindery.
Yes.
And outside, off my bench. Because you kind of get constrained to the size of your bench.
Of course, it's like potters and kilns.
Yeah. And so I went with an idea because I knew that I'd be overwhelmed. And then when I came back, I came back with 3 suites of drawings, and it took me a long time to catch up with myself because the expedition was 9 days, but it was as if I'd done another degree. It was so intense that I just couldn't quite. It took me a long time to digest what I had made and how that had changed my practice so entirely. So I think actually it was that experience that enabled me to work quite differently. And because what it did was, when I was at Goldsmiths, I worked very intuitively before I went to Goldsmiths, and as much as I fought it, I came out of Goldsmiths a conceptual artist, and then was unable to make any work at all. And so that's how I got into bookbinding, you see. And after I'd been to the Arctic, I felt as if I'd come full circle and I'd been able to work intuitively again. And it was through working intuitively that I was then able to work much more from having an idea and then just going in whatever direction that was, be it a drawing, an object be a book or something else. So it just feels very fluid to me now. I'm just making
Wonderful.
stuff.
Wonderful, wonderful. Any more? It's Lizzie.
Do you fine bind your day books or sketchbooks?
No, I mean I've got, this is just a leftover from teaching, but I do tend to use ones that I've made myself, because I quite like how sort of bashed and dirty they get as a result of, just because it goes with me everywhere. So yeah, I think you may as well, really, when you've got a bit of time. Just makes, I mean,
Why not?
why not? I've got the skills to do it, so I might as well just, yeah.
Well, I think we've had a fantastic revelation,
Yes.
haven't we, tonight? I couldn't be more grateful to you, and I'm sure you all agree that we've just gone on this wonderful sort of moonscape adventure, and I don't think there's anything in the world that you won't be exploring one way or another. And I wish you the best of intuition at all times.
Well,
Thank you so much.
Thank
Tracey.
you. Thank you for asking me, and thank you for enabling this piece of work to exist.
Oh, well, it's wonderful, it's beautiful, and it will affect many people, I think. Thank you.
Thank you.
So come in and have a drink and a nibble.